The gleaming spires of New Geneva stretched toward the clouded sky, their crystalline surfaces reflecting the pale light of Earth's struggling sun. 30 years had passed since the Zephyrian Empire had claimed dominion over humanity, and the once proud cities of Earth had been transformed into efficient administrative centers for alien rule. The towering monuments to human achievement now served as mere footnotes to Zephyrian superiority. Marcus Chen pushed his maintenance cart through the pristine corridors of the Imperial Administrative Complex, the soft hum of the building's environmental systems providing a constant backdrop to his solitary work. At 52, he had been cleaning these halls for nearly 2 decades, invisible to the alien administrators who glided past him with their characteristic grace. His weathered hands gripped the handle of his cart, calloused from years of honest labor that the Zephyrians considered beneath their notice. The Zephyrians were magnificent beings, standing nearly 7 feet tall with elongated limbs and skin that shifted through subtle hues of blue and silver depending on their emotional state. Their large, multifaceted eyes could perceive spectrums of light that humans could barely imagine, and their telepathic abilities made verbal communication unnecessary among their own kind. To them, humanity represented a primitive species worthy of preservation only as a curiosity and a source of manual labor. Marcus had witnessed the initial invasion as a young maintenance worker in the old United Nations building. The Zephyrian ships had descended like silver tears from heaven, their arrival heralded not by violence but by an overwhelming demonstration of technological superiority. Within hours, every human military installation, communication network, and power grid had been simultaneously and painlessly disabled. The message was clear: resistance was not just futile, but unnecessary. Humanity would be cared for, protected, and guided by their benevolent new masters. The subjugation had been remarkably gentle by historical standards. No cities were destroyed, no populations relocated against their will. Instead, the Zephyrians had simply assumed control of all major governmental and economic functions, relegating humans to service roles that matched their perceived capabilities. Education was restructured to focus on practical skills rather than scientific advancement. Art and literature were preserved but discouraged from exploring themes of independence or technological progress. Humanity was to be a garden species, beautiful in its simplicity but never allowed to grow beyond its designated boundaries. As Marcus mopped the marble floors of the central atrium, he reflected on the resignation that had settled over his species like a comfortable blanket. Most humans had adapted remarkably well to their new circumstances. The Zephyrians provided excellent healthcare, ensured abundant food supplies, and maintained perfect environmental conditions in all inhabited areas. Crime had virtually disappeared under their gentle but omnipresent surveillance. Wars between human nations were now impossible, as all military decisions flowed through Zephyrian command structures. Yet something nagged at Marcus as he worked his way through the building's endless corridors. Perhaps it was the way the younger generation looked at the Zephyrian administrators with such unquestioning reverence, or how the older humans spoke in hushed tones about the bad old days of human independence. He remembered a time when humans had reached for the stars themselves, when they had dreamed of conquering space and unlocking the mysteries of the universe. Those dreams seemed almost quaint now, like children playing at being adults. The news of Queen Zarathai's return had rippled through the administrative complex with an undercurrent of excitement and nervousness. She had been the architect of humanity's peaceful subjugation, the brilliant strategist who had orchestrated the most efficient conquest in Zephyrian history. For the past 15 years, she had been exploring the outer reaches of the galaxy, cataloging new species and expanding the Empire's influence among the stars. Her return to Earth was both an honor and a source of anxiety for the local administrators who had grown comfortable in their routines. Marcus had seen her once before, shortly after the initial conquest. She had toured the facilities with an air of detached curiosity, observing humanity the way a botanist might study a particularly interesting species of flower. Her skin had maintained a steady azure hue throughout the visit, indicating neither pleasure nor displeasure but rather a clinical assessment of the situation. He remembered being struck by her obvious intelligence and the way other Zephyrians deferred to her with an almost religious reverence. The Queen's ship had arrived 3 days ago, its sleek form settling onto the landing platform atop the administrative complex like a predatory bird claiming its perch. Since then, the entire building had been in a state of barely controlled chaos as administrators prepared for her inspection. Every surface had been polished to perfection, every data file reorganized and updated, every human worker briefed on proper protocols for interacting with royalty. Marcus found himself working longer hours to ensure that every corner of the complex met the impossible standards expected for a royal visit. His joints ached from the extra effort, but he took a quiet pride in his work. If the Zephyrians valued efficiency and cleanliness above all else, then he would provide both in abundance. It was a small form of dignity in a world where human agency had become largely theoretical. As he entered the primary conference chamber on the building's 50th floor, Marcus was struck by the magnificent view of the city below. From this height, the integration of human and Zephyrian architecture was clearly visible. The original human structures remained largely intact, but they were now connected by graceful bridges and platforms that elevated the alien administrators above the terrestrial concerns of their subjects. Gardens cascaded down the sides of buildings, their exotic alien plants thriving in Earth's modified atmosphere. The conference chamber itself was a masterpiece of Zephyrian design, with walls that seemed to shift and flow like liquid crystal. The furniture appeared to have been grown rather than manufactured, with organic curves that perfectly accommodated the alien physiology. At the center of the room stood a massive holographic display capable of showing detailed representations of entire solar systems. Marcus began his cleaning routine with practiced efficiency, starting with the outer edges of the room and working his way toward the center. The Zephyrians had provided him with cleaning solutions that could break down dirt and grime at the molecular level, making his job both easier and more thorough than anything possible with human technology. As he worked, he couldn't help but marvel at the casual way his masters had revolutionized even the most mundane aspects of human existence. The soft chime of the chamber's entry system interrupted his thoughts. Marcus looked up to see Queen Zarathai herself gliding into the room, her movements possessing a fluid grace that seemed to defy gravity. She was even more imposing than he remembered, her presence filling the space with an almost tangible authority. Her skin had shifted to a deep violet hue, which Marcus had learned indicated intense concentration or deep thought. Protocol dictated that Marcus should immediately cease his work and withdraw from the Queen's presence, but something in her posture suggested that she was unaware of his existence. She moved to the central holographic display and activated it with a gesture, causing a three-dimensional map of the local galactic sector to bloom into existence above the conference table. Marcus found himself frozen, uncertain whether to announce his presence or attempt a discreet withdrawal. The Queen began manipulating the display, zooming in on various star systems and calling up detailed data streams that flowed around the hologram like rivers of light. Her focus was so complete that Marcus decided to continue with his work, moving as quietly as possible while keeping one eye on the royal visitor. What he saw in those stolen glances began to trouble him. The Queen's expression, normally composed and regal, showed signs of strain that seemed at odds with the triumphant return that everyone had expected. Her skin continued to shift through darker hues, occasionally flashing brief patterns that Marcus had learned to associate with frustration or uncertainty. When she thought she was unobserved, her shoulders sagged slightly, as if bearing an invisible weight. The holographic display began showing footage from various worlds throughout the galaxy, and Marcus found himself inadvertently witnessing a panorama of Zephyrian expansion that few humans had ever seen. Some planets showed thriving colonies where multiple species lived in apparent harmony under Zephyrian guidance. Others displayed the careful preservation of primitive cultures, with alien civilizations being studied and protected like specimens in a vast zoo. But there were also images that disturbed Marcus deeply, worlds where the local populations had been reduced to mere shadows of their former selves, their technological capabilities stripped away and their cultural identities gradually erased. A pattern began to emerge as Queen Zarathai cycled through the various displays. Each conquered species followed a similar trajectory: initial contact, peaceful subjugation, technological dependency, cultural stagnation, and eventual decline into servitude. The Zephyrians' benevolent conquest was revealed to be a slow-acting poison that destroyed the very essence of what made each species unique. Marcus watched as the Queen called up Earth's profile, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Humanity's trajectory followed the same pattern as dozens of other species, with projections showing continued decline in innovation, artistic expression, and population growth over the coming centuries. The gentle hand of Zephyrian guidance was slowly but inexorably leading his species toward extinction through kindness. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The comfortable life that humanity had been granted was not a gift but a gilded cage, designed to keep his species docile while their essential spark was gradually extinguished. The Zephyrians genuinely believed they were being benevolent, preserving worthy species from the chaos of unguided development. They saw themselves as gardeners tending to a cosmic menagerie, never understanding that their care was killing the very thing they sought to preserve. Queen Zaradai suddenly stiffened, her skin shifting to a pale white that Marcus had never seen before. She had been reviewing the reports from her exploration of the outer galaxy, and something in those distant reaches had clearly disturbed her deeply. Marcus saw images flash across the hologram, star systems stripped bare of life, planets reduced to barren husks, and the remnants of what appeared to be vast technological civilizations that had been completely destroyed. The Queen's hands trembled as she manipulated the controls, bringing up tactical assessments and threat analyses that painted a picture of unimaginable destruction. Something was coming, something that had already consumed entire sectors of the galaxy with an appetite that seemed infinite. The Zephyrian Empire, for all its vast power and technological superiority, appeared to be directly in the path of this cosmic devastation. Marcus realized that he was witnessing a moment of pure, unguarded terror from one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Queen Zaradai was discovering that her empire's greatest weakness was not military inferiority or technological limitations, but the very philosophy that had driven their expansion. By reducing every species they encountered to helpless dependency, the Zephyrians had created a galaxy full of potential allies who lacked the strength or will to fight against a truly existential threat. The irony was devastating in its completeness. The Zephyrians' success in creating a peaceful, ordered galaxy had left them uniquely vulnerable to an enemy that cared nothing for peace or order. They had cultivated gardens full of beautiful flowers, only to discover that they needed warriors to defend against an approaching wildfire. As Marcus watched the Queen's growing desperation, he felt something stir within him that he had not experienced in decades, the fierce pride of a species that had once reached for the stars with bloody, stubborn hands. Humanity had not always been wise or kind, but they had been survivors. They had faced extinction dozens of times throughout their history and had always found a way to adapt, to fight, to endure against impossible odds. The cleaning cart slipped from Marcus's suddenly nerveless fingers, and the soft clatter of metal against marble echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Queen Zaradai spun around, her large eyes fixing on the human who had just witnessed the Empire's darkest secret. For a long moment, they stared at each other across a gulf that seemed to span not just species but entire philosophies of existence. Marcus straightened his shoulders and met the Queen's gaze directly, surprising them both with his lack of deference. In that moment, he was not a janitor or a servant or a member of a subject species. He was a human being who had just seen his people's hidden strength reflected in his master's sudden weakness, and, for the first time in 30 years, he refused to look away. Queen Zaradai's skin rippled through a spectrum of colors that Marcus had never seen before, settling into deep crimson streaks against her natural blue. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with implications that neither had anticipated when the day began. Marcus could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, but something deeper than fear kept him standing upright, meeting her gaze with steady determination. "How long have you been in this chamber?" The Queen's voice carried harmonics that resonated directly in Marcus's mind, a telepathic overlay that made her words seem to come from inside his own thoughts. 20 minutes, Your Majesty." Marcus's voice was steadier than he had expected, carrying none of the servile trembling that usually characterized human speech in the presence of Zephyrian royalty. Queen Zaradai moved closer, her elongated form gliding across the polished floor with predatory grace. Up close, Marcus could see the intricate patterns that played across her skin, revealing emotional complexities that few humans had ever been privileged to witness. Her multifaceted eyes studied him with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into his soul. "You have seen the tactical assessments. You understand what approaches our realm." It was not a question but a statement that carried the weight of cosmic inevitability. "I've seen enough," Marcus replied, surprising himself with his boldness. "Something's coming that scares you. Something your empire isn't prepared to face." The Queen's skin shifted to a pale silver, indicating what Marcus had learned was profound shock. In 30 years of ruling over humanity, No human had ever spoken to her with such directness. The carefully maintained hierarchy that defined Zephyrian society had no framework for this moment of raw honesty between ruler and subject. "The Devourers," Queen Zarathai said finally, her mental voice carrying undertones of despair that made Marcus's skin crawl. "They have consumed 17 sectors of the outer galaxy. Entire civilizations, reduced to cosmic dust in a matter of days. They absorb not just material resources but the very essence of organized life itself." Marcus watched as the Queen manipulated the holographic display, showing him footage that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The Devourers appeared to be vast, interconnected swarms of mechanical entities that moved through space like living clouds of destruction. They didn't simply destroy worlds, they unmade them at a fundamental level, breaking down matter and energy into component particles that were then incorporated into their ever-growing mass. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked, his maintenance worker's pragmatism cutting through the cosmic horror of what he was witnessing. "The swarm moves at approximately 1/10 light speed between systems, consuming everything in its path to fuel its expansion. Based on current trajectory and consumption rates, they will reach this sector in approximately 4 standard years." 4 years. Marcus felt the weight of that timeline settling into his bones. 4 years to prepare for something that had already destroyed civilizations far more advanced than either humanity or the Zephyrian Empire. 4 years to find a solution to a problem that seemed to defy every conventional understanding of warfare and survival. What has the Empire done to prepare? Marcus continued his questioning, amazed at his own audacity but driven by a need to understand the scope of the threat. Queen Zarathai's skin cycled through several rapid color changes before settling into a deep purple that Marcus recognized as shame. "The High Council believes that our advanced technology and superior military capabilities will be sufficient to repel the threat. They have ordered the construction of additional battlecruisers and the development of new weapons systems." "But you don't think that will work?" "I have studied the tactical recordings from 16 different encounters between the Devourers and various galactic civilizations. In every case, conventional military responses were not merely defeated but actively incorporated into the swarm's capabilities. The Devourers learn from each encounter, adapting and improving their effectiveness with each victory. They have already absorbed the military technologies of dozens of species far more advanced than our own." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind working through the implications. "So traditional warfare just makes them stronger. Every weapon you fire at them, every tactical innovation you develop, becomes part of their arsenal." "Precisely." The Queen's acknowledgement carried a bitter edge that transcended species barriers. "The High Council refuses to acknowledge this pattern. They believe that Zephyrian superiority will overcome any obstacle through the application of sufficient force and intelligence." For a moment, Marcus almost felt sympathy for the alien queen. She was trapped between an impossible enemy and the rigid thinking of her own species, carrying knowledge that her government refused to accept. The weight of that responsibility would have broken a lesser being, but Queen Zarathai had endured 15 years of exploration and discovery, only to return home with news that threatened everything her people had built. "There has to be another way," Marcus said, more to himself than to the Queen. "Something the other civilizations didn't try, some approach that the Devourers haven't encountered yet." Queen Zarathai's eyes focused on him with sudden intensity, her skin shifting to bright gold patterns that Marcus had learned indicated excitement or hope. "The thought has occurred to me. In all my research, I have found one constant among the failed civilizations: they were all highly advanced, perfectly ordered societies with sophisticated technological infrastructures. Like the Zephyrian Empire." "Yes. And, like most of the species we have guided toward peaceful development over the past several centuries." The admission hung in the air between them like an accusation. "We have created a galaxy full of potential allies who lack the chaotic creativity and adaptive resilience necessary to face an unprecedented threat." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. The same benevolent guidance that had given humanity 30 years of peace and prosperity had also stripped away the very qualities that might make them useful in the coming war. Human innovation had been channeled into safe, approved directions. Human aggression had been sublimated into harmless competition and artistic expression. Human adaptability had been replaced by comfortable dependence on Zephyrian systems and support. What about species that were never conquered? Marcus asked. Surely there must be some civilizations out there that maintained their independence? Few and far between, the Queen replied, calling up new displays that showed scattered pockets of uncontrolled space scattered throughout the galaxy. Most independent species are either too primitive to be useful against the Devourers or too aggressive to cooperate with Empire forces. There are perhaps 3 or 4 civilizations that might qualify as potential allies, but they represent a tiny fraction of the galaxy's total population. As Marcus studied the holographic displays, a wild idea began to form in his mind. It was audacious beyond belief, potentially treasonous, and almost certainly doomed to failure. But it was also the kind of desperate gamble that his species had built their entire history upon. What if you're looking at this backwards? Marcus said slowly, his voice gaining confidence as the idea crystallized. What if the answer isn't finding civilizations that maintain their independence, but helping conquered species rediscover the qualities that made them dangerous in the first place? Queen Zarathai's entire body went rigid, her skin cycling through colors so rapidly that Marcus couldn't identify individual hues. The suggestion he had just made went against every principle of Zephyrian civilization, challenging not just their methods but their fundamental understanding of what constituted proper galactic governance. You are proposing to deliberately destabilize peaceful civilizations, the Queen said, her mental voice carrying undertones of horror and fascination in equal measure. To encourage chaos, conflict, and uncontrolled development among species that we have spent centuries guiding toward harmony. I'm proposing to wake them up, Marcus replied firmly. To remind them who they used to be before you made them safe and comfortable and dependent. The Devourers have never faced an enemy that refused to follow the rules, that adapted faster than they could learn, that turned their own adaptability against them. The Queen began pacing around the chamber, her movements betraying an agitation that would have been unthinkable in normal circumstances. Marcus could practically see the mental calculations running behind her multifaceted eyes as she weighed the implications of his suggestion against the approaching threat. Even if such a strategy were theoretically sound, she said finally, the political ramifications would be catastrophic. The High Council would never approve the deliberate destabilization of conquered territories. The risk of widespread rebellion, the potential for chaos to spread beyond our control, the violation of every treaty and agreement we have made with subject species. Your Majesty, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made the Queen stop her pacing. With respect, in 4 years none of that will matter. The Devourers don't make treaties. They don't negotiate. They don't leave survivors to worry about political ramifications. The truth of that statement hit Queen Zarathai like a physical blow. Her skin settled into the deep violet that indicated profound contemplation, and Marcus could see her weighing the certain destruction of everything she knew against the uncertain chaos of his proposed solution. You speak of awakening conquered species, the Queen said after a long pause. But where would such an experiment begin? How does one deliberately introduce chaos into a perfectly ordered system without destroying the very thing you seek to save? Marcus felt a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You start with the species you understand the least. The one that's given you the most trouble despite 30 years of careful guidance. The one that still produces individuals crazy enough to suggest treason to an alien queen who could have them executed with a thought. Humanity. Humanity, Marcus confirmed. We're probably your best test case because we're too stubborn to die quietly and too stupid to know when we're beaten. If you can figure out how to wake us up without destroying us in the process, you might have a model for awakening the rest of the galaxy. Queen Zarathai moved to the massive window that dominated one wall of the chamber, gazing out at the city below where millions of humans went about their carefully ordered lives. From this height, the integration of human and Zephyrian architecture told the story of 30 years of gentle conquest, of a species gradually learning to accept their place in a larger cosmic order. The process would have to be subtle, the Queen mused, her mental voice taking on the analytical tone that Marcus had learned indicated deep strategic thinking. Too rapid a change would trigger security protocols and draw attention from the High Council. Too slow, and the Devourers would arrive before the awakening could take effect. But it's possible? Perhaps. The queen's skin showed flickers of gold against the violet, hope beginning to war with resignation. There are certain adjustments that could be made to educational curricula, to resource allocation, to the permitted scope of human research and development. Small changes that would appear to be routine administrative modifications but would gradually reintroduce elements of challenge and uncertainty into human society. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerating as the Queen's words began to paint a picture of possibility. It was a plan born of desperation and built on assumptions that could prove catastrophically wrong, but it was also the first genuine hope he had felt in decades. There would be risks, Queen Zaradai continued, her voice carrying new urgency. If the High Council discovered what we were doing before the necessity became apparent, both of our species would face consequences that I cannot fully predict. And if the experiment succeeded but arrived too late to make a difference against the devourers, then we'll die as ourselves instead of as pets, Marcus finished. I can live with that. The question is whether you can. The Queen turned back to face him, and Marcus saw something in her multifaceted eyes that he had never expected to see in a Zephyrian: uncertainty. Not the careful, analytical uncertainty of a mind processing complex data, but the raw, emotional uncertainty of a being facing a choice that would define the fate of billions. If we do this, she said slowly, there will be no returning to the way things were. Once awakened, human consciousness cannot be easily guided back into comfortable compliance. You would be gambling not just with your own species' survival, but with the entire structure of galactic civilization as we know it. Your Majesty, Marcus said with quiet conviction, I think that structure is already doomed. The question is whether we're going to die trying to preserve it or die trying to create something that might actually survive what's coming. Queen Zaradai's skin settled into a steady, brilliant silver that Marcus had never seen before. In the strange light it cast, the chamber seemed transformed, less like a sterile conference room and more like a place where history might be made. Very well, the Queen said, and Marcus could hear the weight of cosmic decision in her mental voice. We begin the awakening. The changes began slowly, so subtly that most humans didn't notice them at first. Marcus watched from his unique position as Queen Zaradai orchestrated what she privately called the controlled awakening, a series of seemingly minor administrative adjustments that began to reintroduce chaos into humanity's carefully ordered existence. The first modification affected educational curricula across Earth's academic institutions. Where Zephyrian guidance had previously emphasized cooperation, consensus building, and adherence to established protocols, new directives began encouraging independent research, competitive innovation, and what the official documentation euphemistically termed creative problem-solving initiatives. Students who had been trained to seek approval before pursuing new ideas suddenly found themselves rewarded for taking intellectual risks. Marcus observed the changes during his evening shifts at the local university complex, where he had taken on additional cleaning duties to supplement his primary work at the administrative center. The transformation in student behavior was remarkable. Young people who had spent years passively absorbing approved knowledge began forming unauthorized study groups, challenging their instructors' conclusions, and proposing research projects that pushed against the boundaries of sanctioned inquiry. Dr. Elena Vasquez was among the first to notice the shift in academic atmosphere. A former astrophysicist who had spent 15 years teaching basic mathematics under Zephyrian oversight, she found herself suddenly granted access to previously restricted research databases. The official explanation cited new educational efficiency initiatives, but Elena recognized an opportunity when she saw one. Within weeks, she had assembled a small team of graduate students to investigate discrepancies in the official astronomical surveys that had puzzled her for years. The Zephyrians' public data showed a universe filled with orderly star systems and peaceful civilizations, but Elena's unauthorized analysis revealed signs of massive cosmic disruptions in distant sectors that didn't match the approved narrative. Marcus encountered Dr. Vasquez one evening as she worked late in her makeshift laboratory, her desk covered with printouts and holographic projections that would have been forbidden just months earlier. She looked up as he entered to empty the waste receptacles, her eyes bright with the kind of intellectual excitement that had been rare among humans for decades. You know, she said without preamble, apparently needing to share her discoveries with someone, the official star charts show stellar formations that are physically impossible according to basic gravitational mechanics. Either the Zephyrians don't understand physics as well as they claim, or they're hiding something significant about what's happening out there. Marcus paused in his cleaning, recognizing an opportunity to seed information that might prove crucial later. What kind of impossible formations? Entire star systems that appear to have been consumed from the inside out, leaving gravity wells that suggest massive objects that no longer exist. And the pattern is spreading, always moving inward from the galactic rim toward the core systems. Elena pulled up a holographic display that showed the progression of these anomalies over time. If I didn't know better, I'd say something was systematically devouring its way through the outer galaxy. Maybe you should trust your instincts, Marcus said carefully. Sometimes the impossible explanation is the only one that fits the facts. Dr. Vasquez studied him with new interest, perhaps recognizing something in his tone that suggested knowledge beyond what a janitor should possess. Do you think the Zephyrians know about this? I think the Zephyrians know about a lot of things they don't share with us, Marcus replied. The question is whether that's going to change before it's too late. The second phase of Queen Zarathai's plan involved subtle modifications to resource allocation systems. Human researchers and engineers suddenly found themselves with access to materials and equipment that had been restricted for decades. Fabrication facilities that had been limited to producing simple consumer goods were quietly upgraded with capabilities that approached pre-conquest technological levels. The changes were implemented through what appeared to be routine efficiency upgrades, with Zephyrian administrators explaining that improved human productivity would benefit the entire galactic economy. In reality, Queen Zarathai was systematically removing the constraints that had prevented humanity from developing technologies that might prove useful against an unconventional enemy. Marcus watched the transformation accelerate as human ingenuity began to reassert itself after 30 years of suppression. Engineers started designing solutions to problems that the Zephyrians had solved with superior technology, but their approaches were fundamentally different. Where Zephyrian solutions emphasized elegance, efficiency, and integration with existing systems, human innovations were characterized by adaptability, redundancy, and what could only be described as creative stubbornness. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. James Morrison had been a security systems analyst before the conquest, responsible for designing networks that could withstand both conventional attacks and unconventional threats. Under Zephyrian rule, he had been reassigned to maintaining simple surveillance equipment, his expertise deemed unnecessary in a perfectly ordered society. When the new directives granted him access to advanced fabrication systems, James began working on what he termed adaptive defense networks. Instead of trying to predict specific threats and design countermeasures, his systems were built to recognize patterns of attack and evolve defenses in real time. The networks were deliberately chaotic, incorporating random elements that made them impossible to predict or counter through conventional analysis. Marcus encountered James during one of his late-night maintenance rounds, finding the engineer hunched over a workstation covered with prototypes that looked more like abstract art than functional technology. The devices seemed to shift and change even as Marcus watched, their surfaces rippling with patterns that defied easy categorization. They're learning systems, James explained when he noticed Marcus's interest. Each node is independently capable of analyzing threats and developing responses, but they also share information with other nodes through quantum encrypted channels that change frequency randomly. Even I don't know exactly how they'll respond to a given threat because they're constantly evolving new strategies. Sounds complicated, Marcus observed. What happens if they evolve in directions you don't expect? James grinned, and Marcus was struck by how long it had been since he'd seen that kind of fierce joy on a human face. That's the beauty of it. I'm not trying to control their evolution, just set the parameters and let them figure out the details. If something comes at us that we've never seen before, these systems will adapt to it faster than any centrally controlled network could manage. And the Zephyrians approve of this research? Officially, I'm working on improved efficiency protocols for waste management systems, James replied with a conspiratorial wink. What I'm actually building is something that could theoretically defend against threats that don't follow conventional patterns of attack. Marcus felt a surge of pride that caught him by surprise. This was what humans had been before the conquest, problem solvers who refused to accept that anything was impossible, who found ways to turn their weaknesses into strengths and their chaos into weapons. For the first time in 30 years, he began to believe that his species might have something valuable to contribute to their own survival. The third phase of the awakening involved the most dangerous step, gradually revealing the true scope of the threat facing the galaxy. Queen Zarathai couldn't simply announce the existence of the Devourers without triggering security protocols that would shut down the entire project, but she could begin seeding information that would prepare key humans for the revelation. The process required careful selection of individuals who had demonstrated both the intellectual capacity to understand the implications and the emotional resilience to function effectively despite cosmic-scale terror. Dr. Vasquez's astronomical research made her an obvious candidate, as did James Morrison's work on adaptive defense systems. But Queen Zarathai also identified candidates in other fields: biologists studying ecosystem resilience, psychologists researching human adaptability under stress, and philosophers exploring the nature of consciousness and survival. Marcus found himself serving as an unofficial intermediary, his janitorial duties providing cover for private conversations with selected individuals. The irony wasn't lost on him that humanity's awakening was being coordinated by someone whose job had made him invisible to both species for decades. The revelation process began with Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose astronomical research had brought her closest to the truth. Marcus found her working late one evening, her face illuminated by holographic displays showing stellar formation data that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of galactic disruption. "The pattern is accelerating," she said without looking up as Marcus entered the laboratory. "Whatever's causing these stellar anomalies is moving faster now, and the affected regions are getting larger. At current rates of expansion, the disruption will reach our local stellar group within 5 years." Marcus set down his cleaning supplies and moved closer to examine the display. "Have you shared this analysis with anyone else?" "I've submitted reports to the Astronomical Survey Committee, but they keep getting classified and disappeared into Zephyrian administrative channels. Either they don't believe my conclusions or they already know what's happening and don't want the information to become public." "What if it's both?" Marcus asked carefully. "What if the Zephyrians know exactly what's coming but believe their current preparations will be sufficient to handle it?" Elena turned to look at him directly, her eyes sharp with intelligence and growing suspicion. "You speak like someone who knows more than a maintenance worker should. Who are you really, Marcus-chan?" Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier, but the approaching threat had stripped away the luxury of excessive caution. "I'm someone who's been given access to information that paints a very different picture of our future than what the official reports suggest. And I think you're exactly the kind of person who needs to know the truth." Over the next hour, Marcus carefully revealed what he had learned about the Devourers, their pattern of galactic consumption, and the inadequacy of conventional military responses. He watched Elena's expression shift from skepticism to horror to grim determination as the implications became clear. "You're telling me that everything the Zephyrians have built, everything they've taught us about galactic civilization, is essentially a cosmic dead end," she said finally. "That their perfect order is exactly what makes them vulnerable to this threat. I'm telling you that survival might require us to rediscover qualities that our conquerors spent 30 years trying to eliminate from human nature," Marcus replied. "Chaos, unpredictability, the willingness to try solutions that have never been tested and might not work." Elena was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of revelation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of steel that Marcus hadn't heard from a human in decades. "What do you need me to do?" The recruitment process continued over the following weeks, with Marcus carefully approaching individuals whose research or expertise might prove crucial in the coming crisis. Each conversation was a calculated risk, but Queen Zarathai's modifications to surveillance systems provided windows of opportunity for these forbidden discussions. James Morrison's reaction was immediate and practical. Within hours of learning about the Devourers, he was redesigning his adaptive defense networks to incorporate scenarios involving swarm-based attacks by learning enemies. Dr. Sarah Chen, a biologist studying ecosystem collapse and recovery, began developing theoretical frameworks for maintaining species diversity under extreme selective pressure. Professor David Kim, a philosopher who had spent years contemplating the nature of consciousness, started exploring how human cognitive patterns might differ from those of machine intelligences in ways that could prove tactically significant. But, perhaps the most important recruitment was Maria Santos, a former military strategist who had been reassigned to logistics coordination after the conquest. Her reaction to the revelation was immediate and uncompromising. "If what you're telling me is true," she said after Marcus had finished explaining the situation, "then we need to start preparing for asymmetric warfare on a scale that's never been attempted. Not just tactics and weapons, but an entirely different philosophy of conflict." "What do you mean?" Maria's eyes took on the focused intensity of someone whose expertise had suddenly become relevant again. Conventional warfare assumes that both sides are playing by similar rules, using comparable technologies and strategies. But, if the devourers adapt to and incorporate every conventional approach they encounter, then our only chance is to fight in ways they can't predict or understand. Human ways. Exactly. We need to rediscover what made us dangerous before we became civilized. Not just our technology or our tactics, but our fundamental approach to problem solving. The willingness to try impossible solutions, to embrace chaos as a tool, to keep fighting even when logic says we should surrender. As Maria spoke, Marcus felt something awakening in his chest that he had thought was permanently dead. It was the same feeling he had experienced while watching Queen Zarathai discover the scope of the approaching threat, the recognition that humanity's greatest weaknesses might actually be their hidden strengths. The awakening was accelerating beyond Queen Zarathai's careful projections, driven by a momentum that seemed to feed on itself. Each human who learned the truth began seeking others who shared their growing sense of urgency. Underground networks formed spontaneously, connecting researchers, engineers, and thinkers who had spent years in enforced isolation from their own species' potential. Marcus found himself at the center of these emerging connections, his janitorial duties providing the perfect cover for coordinating between groups that would normally never interact. He carried messages between Dr. Vasquez's astronomical research team and James Morrison's engineering workshops, facilitated meetings between Maria Santos's strategic planning sessions and Dr. Chen's biological analysis groups. For the first time since the conquest, humans were working together on projects that their government hadn't approved, pursuing solutions that their masters couldn't predict or control. It was dangerous, potentially treasonous, and absolutely essential for any hope of species survival. The transformation was remarkable to witness. People who had spent decades as passive recipients of Zephyrian guidance were rediscovering their capacity for independent thought and action. The comfortable resignation that had characterized human society for 30 years was giving way to something fierce and determined and fundamentally human. But Marcus knew that time was running short. The underground network was growing too large to remain secret much longer, and Queen Zarathai's increasingly frequent meetings with him were bound to attract attention eventually. Soon, they would have to reveal the truth to humanity as a whole and hope that 30 years of guided evolution hadn't permanently damaged their species' ability to respond to an existential threat. The real test was coming, and Marcus wasn't sure that either humanity or the Zephyrian Empire was ready for what that test would reveal about the true nature of survival in a universe that didn't care about the difference between civilized and primitive, between order and chaos, between master and servant. The discovery was inevitable, but it came sooner than anyone had anticipated. Marcus was coordinating a late-night meeting between Dr. Vasquez's research team and Maria Santos's strategic planning group when the lights in the conference room suddenly blazed to full intensity. The sealed door dilated with the characteristic whisper of Zephyrian security systems, and Commander Thexbar entered with a squad of enforcement officers whose skin patterns indicated extreme agitation. The Zephyrian security chief was one of the most imposing members of his species that Marcus had ever encountered, standing nearly 8 feet tall with skin that maintained a steady deep red coloration indicating controlled anger. His multifaceted eyes swept the room, taking in the unauthorized gathering, the prohibited research materials scattered across the table, and the faces of humans who had clearly been engaged in activities far beyond their approved scope of responsibility. "Explain this gathering." Commander Thexbar's telepathic voice resonated with authority that made several humans instinctively step backward. "These individuals have no authorized reason to be in this facility during off-duty hours, and preliminary scans indicate the presence of classified materials that exceed their security clearances." Marcus felt the weight of 30 years of careful invisibility crashing down around him. In seconds, everything that he and Queen Zarathai had worked to build would be exposed and destroyed. The awakening process would be terminated, the underground networks would be dismantled, and humanity would face the devourers as docile, unprepared prey. But, as Marcus opened his mouth to attempt some explanation that might preserve the project, Dr. Vasquez stepped forward with a calm confidence that surprised everyone in the room. "We're working on a research project that we believe has critical importance for galactic security," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious danger. "We've discovered evidence of massive stellar disruptions that suggest a threat approaching from the outer galaxy, and we felt obligated to investigate further despite the irregular circumstances." Commander Thexvar's skin rippled through several rapid color changes, indicating the kind of deep confusion that rarely troubled Zephyrian officers. "You are unauthorized to conduct galactic security research. Such investigations are the exclusive province of Imperial Intelligence Services. Which is why we're prepared to transfer all of our findings to the appropriate authorities immediately," Maria Santos interjected smoothly, moving to stand beside Dr. Vasquez. "We recognize that we've exceeded our authority, but we believe the potential significance of our discoveries justifies the breach of protocol." Marcus watched in amazement as the two women began presenting their research to the security commander with the kind of systematic thoroughness that characterized the best human scholarship. They laid out the astronomical evidence for cosmic disruption, the theoretical frameworks for understanding unconventional threats, and the preliminary designs for adaptive defense systems that might prove effective against unknown enemies. Commander Thexvar listened with growing agitation, his skin cycling through colors that indicated everything from skepticism to horror as the scope of the humans' unauthorized research became clear. When they finished their presentation, the silence in the room stretched for nearly a full minute. "This research violates 17 different security protocols," the commander finally said, but his telepathic voice carried uncertainty rather than condemnation. "The materials you have compiled represent intelligence above your clearance levels, and your conclusions suggest threats that have not been officially acknowledged by Imperial Command." "Sir," Dr. Vasquez said carefully, "does that mean our conclusions are wrong, or that the official acknowledgement hasn't reached our level of the bureaucracy yet?" It was a masterfully phrased question that forced the security commander to choose between revealing classified information or implicitly confirming the existence of the threat that the humans had discovered. Marcus could see Thexvar's skin shifting through rapid patterns as he calculated the implications of either response. "You will remain here while I consult with higher authority," the commander finally decided. "This matter requires guidance from individuals with clearance levels far above my own." As the security squad withdrew to establish a perimeter around the conference room, Marcus found himself trapped with 7 other humans who had just painted themselves as either brilliant researchers or dangerous criminals, depending on how the Zephyrian hierarchy chose to interpret their discoveries. The irony was devastating: they had been exposed while attempting to save both species from destruction. The wait stretched for nearly 3 hours, during which Marcus and his colleagues alternated between nervous conversation and tense silence. Through the room's massive windows, they could see the city below continuing its normal patterns of activity, unaware that the fate of 2 species might be decided in this single chamber before dawn. When the door finally opened again, it was not Commander Thexvar who entered but Queen Zarathai herself, accompanied by a retinue of senior advisors whose skin patterns indicated the kind of intense deliberation that preceded momentous decisions. Marcus felt his heart hammering as the alien queen's multifaceted eyes swept the room, lingering on him for just a moment longer than protocol would suggest. "I have reviewed your unauthorized research," Queen Zarathai announced, her telepathic voice carrying formal authority that filled the chamber. "Your conclusions regarding stellar disruptions in the outer galaxy are correct. Your theoretical frameworks for understanding unconventional threats are remarkably sophisticated for individuals without formal military training. Your proposed defensive innovations show promise that exceeds our initial expectations." Dr. Vasquez stepped forward with careful respect. "Your Majesty, if our research has value, we respectfully request permission to continue it under proper Imperial oversight." "Dr. Vasquez, your research has value precisely because it was conducted without Imperial oversight," Queen Zarathai replied, and Marcus could hear subtle amusement beneath her formal tone. "You have approached problems from perspectives that would never occur to properly trained Zephyrian analysts. Your solutions incorporate elements of chaos and unpredictability that we have been systematically trained to avoid." The Queen moved to the holographic display that still showed Dr. Vasquez's stellar disruption data, manipulating the controls to overlay new information that revealed the true scope of the Devourer threat. Gasps echoed through the chamber as the humans saw for the first time the complete tactical picture that Marcus had witnessed months earlier. "The threat you have discovered approaches this sector with inexorable momentum," Queen Zarathai continued. "Conventional military preparations have proven inadequate against this enemy in every recorded encounter. The High Council has finally acknowledged that new approaches may be necessary for species survival." Maria Santos spoke with the directness of a career military strategist. "What kind of new approaches, Your Majesty?" "The kind that require abandoning 30 years of careful guidance and allowing conquered species to rediscover qualities that we have spent decades trying to suppress." The Queen's admission carried weight that reverberated through the chamber like a physical force. "We need allies who can think and fight in ways that our enemy cannot predict or counter. We need chaos as a weapon against perfect order." Marcus felt the moment crystallizing around them like a decision point that would define the future of galactic civilization. Everything that he and Queen Zarathai had worked toward in secret was being revealed in open session, with consequences that neither could fully predict. "You're asking us to become dangerous again," James Morrison said, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "We are asking you to become yourselves again," Queen Zarathai corrected. "To rediscover the qualities that allowed your species to survive and thrive despite facing extinction dozens of times throughout your history. To remember what it means to be human in the face of impossible odds." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications that stretched far beyond the immediate crisis. For 30 years, humanity had accepted their role as a protected species, trading independence for security and innovation for stability. Now their former conquerors were asking them to reclaim the very qualities that had made conquest necessary in the first place. Dr. Chin spoke first, her voice steady but carrying undertones of profound emotion. "If we do this, if we awaken the parts of human nature that the Zephyrians have spent decades trying to suppress, there's no guarantee that we'll be able to control what emerges." "Control has always been an illusion," Queen Zarathai replied. "What we are proposing is to embrace the lack of control as a strategic advantage. To turn humanity's unpredictability into a weapon that our enemy cannot adapt to because adaptation requires understanding, and understanding requires patterns that humans consistently refuse to follow." Marcus stepped forward, feeling the weight of his unique position as the bridge between species. "Your Majesty, what exactly are you proposing? What would this awakening look like in practical terms?" "Complete removal of technological restrictions on human research and development. Unlimited access to imperial databases and fabrication facilities. Authorization for independent military command structures operating under human strategic doctrine rather than Zephyrian protocols." The Queen's list was breathtaking in its scope. "In essence, we are proposing to reverse the conquest and treat humanity as an equal partner in galactic defense rather than a protected subject species." The implications hit the room like a shockwave. What Queen Zarathai was describing wasn't just a modification of existing arrangements but a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between the two species. Humanity would regain not just their independence but access to technologies and resources that exceeded their wildest pre-conquest dreams. There would be risks, Maria Santos pointed out with characteristic military precision. Humans with access to Zephyrian technology could become a threat to the Empire itself, especially if old resentments about the conquest resurface. "That risk is acceptable," Queen Zarathai replied without hesitation. "The alternative is mutual extinction within 4 years. We would rather face the possibility of human rebellion than the certainty of devourer consumption." James Morrison raised a practical concern. "How do we implement something like this without triggering mass panic or political instability?" "You're talking about overturning 3 decades of social conditioning in a matter of months. We begin with select populations and expand systematically," the Queen explained. "Research facilities, military installations, educational centers where the transition can be managed and monitored. The awakening process will be guided but not controlled, encouraged but not forced." Marcus found himself thinking about the millions of humans who had never known life under any system other than Zephyrian guidance. An entire generation had grown up accepting alien rule as the natural order of things, and many older humans had come to view the conquest as ultimately beneficial despite their personal losses. The psychological challenges of awakening such a thoroughly conditioned population would be enormous. But, even as he considered the difficulties, Marcus felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. Not the resigned hope of a comfortable slave, but the fierce hope of a species that refused to surrender regardless of the odds against them. It was the same emotion he had seen in Queen Zarathai's eyes when she first acknowledged the necessity of their impossible alliance. "When do we begin?" Dr. Vasquez asked, and Marcus could hear the eagerness in her voice that matched his own feelings. "We have already begun," Queen Zarathai replied. "Your unauthorized research, your illegal gatherings, your violation of security protocols, all of this has been part of a carefully orchestrated process designed to identify and prepare individuals capable of handling the transition. You are the first wave of humanity's awakening." The revelation that their discovery had been anticipated, that their rebellion had been guided, should have been disturbing. Instead, Marcus felt a grudging admiration for the alien queen's strategic thinking. She had managed to identify and recruit the humans most likely to succeed in their new role while maintaining the illusion of spontaneous discovery that made their commitment genuine. "What about the rest of your people?" Dr. Chen asked. "How does the Zephyrian High Council feel about abandoning 30 years of imperial policy?" Queen Zarathai's skin shifted to the deep violet that Marcus had learned indicated profound sadness. "The High Council continues to believe that conventional military preparations will prove sufficient against the Devourer threat. They have authorized limited experimental programs with subject species, but they do not fully comprehend the scope of change that will be necessary for survival. So we're not just fighting to save our own species," Maria Santos observed. "We're fighting to save yours as well, whether they want us to or not." "Yes," Queen Zarathai confirmed. "The irony is not lost on me that humanity's salvation may require them to save their former conquerors from the consequences of their own success." As the meeting continued into the early morning hours, Marcus found himself amazed at how naturally the two species began working together once the pretense of hierarchy was abandoned. Humans and Zephyrians collaborated on strategic planning with an efficiency that exceeded anything either group had achieved separately. Ideas flowed back and forth with the kind of creative synergy that could only emerge when different perspectives were allowed to combine freely. By dawn, they had outlined the basic framework for humanity's awakening, a systematic program that would begin with key research facilities and expand outward through educational institutions, manufacturing centers, and eventually civilian populations. The process would be disguised as efficiency improvements and security upgrades to avoid triggering opposition from conservative elements within both species. But Marcus understood that what they were really planning was nothing less than a revolution in the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. For the first time in their history, the Zephyrians were acknowledging that their perfect order might be inferior to human chaos, that their technological superiority might be less valuable than human adaptability, that their ancient wisdom might be less important than human stubbornness. As the meeting finally concluded and the participants began to disperse to their normal duties, Queen Zarathai approached Marcus with the same directness she had shown during their first private conversation. "You understand that there is no guarantee of success," she said, her telepathic voice carrying personal rather than royal authority. "We may be creating something that destroys both of our species rather than saving them." "Your Majesty," Marcus replied with quiet conviction, 30 years ago, you conquered humanity because we were dangerous and unpredictable and refused to accept limitations. Now you're asking us to become dangerous and unpredictable again because that's the only thing that might save us all. I think that's exactly the kind of impossible irony that humans specialize in turning into victory." Queen Zarathai's skin shifted to the brilliant silver that Marcus had learned indicated profound hope. "Then, perhaps," she said, "it is time to discover what impossible victories look like when two species refuse to accept defeat." 18 months after the awakening began, Marcus stood in what had once been the Zephyrian Administrative Complex's pristine conference chamber, now transformed into something that defied easy categorization. The walls hummed with energy from human-designed adaptive systems that shifted and reconfigured themselves in response to changing tactical requirements. Holographic displays showed real-time data from across the solar system, where joint human-Zephyrian fleets prepared for a confrontation that would determine the survival of both species. The Devourers had accelerated their approach, consuming star systems at an unprecedented rate as they fed on the technological civilizations in their path. Long-range sensors showed the swarm now less than 8 months away from Earth's solar system, a writhing mass of interconnected machines that had grown to encompass volumes of space larger than most star systems. But the solar system they were approaching bore little resemblance to the ordered, peaceful realm they would have encountered 2 years earlier. The awakening had spread through humanity like wildfire, igniting changes that had astonished even Queen Zarathai with their scope and speed. What had begun as controlled modifications to research protocols had evolved into a complete transformation of human society and, by extension, the entire structure of local galactic civilization. Dr. Elena Vasquez now commanded a research station